Kenny, I saw the film and I was deeply impressed by it. One of the things that came to my mind was how Hoxsey really got under your skin. How did Hoxsey enter into your life?
Well, not unlike a lot of other people. Unfortunately, my father died of cancer. In fact, I got a call one evening from my mom, and 6 months later, he was dead at the age of 55. And I was rather traumatized by that experience. And I had already been very interested in alternative medicine for personal reasons, so I knew a lot about the field, but I thought the whole idea of alternative cancer therapies was outrageous, frankly. But about 2 weeks after my father's death, in the mail unbidden, I got this newsletter with testimonials from reputedly terminal cancer patients who got well when they weren't supposed to, using this metabolic and nutritional regimen. And I decided, if there were anything at all to this, I better find out about it. And so I just started on this whole journey of research, and I'm a writer and interested just as a human being. And what I found was I fell through the rabbit hole to this parallel universe of all these people who got well when they weren't supposed to. And it was through all different kinds of methods, and it was kind of mind-boggling. And about 2 years into it or so, I came across this astounding story of Hoxsey. And a light bulb went off in my head because I realized that, like everything else, medicine is political. And the real thrust of the story is that this guy was politically railroaded instead of medically tested. And the very basis of science is the impartial, even-handed, investigation of data, and try to look at things in a dispassionate view and look at outcomes, not at ideology. So that really captured my imagination, and that was the beginning.
Now, you became involved with Hoxsey before the early 90s when the Office of Alternative Medicine came along, was set up through congressional action, which legitimized much of what we call alternative medicine. These were the pre-90s, though, that you did this. So this was a whole new era. Viewers may not understand how difficult it was for you to actually make this film in those days.
Yeah, I started the movie in 1984, and at that time, talking about alternative cancer therapies had as much credibility as talking about UFOs. I mean, people would just look at you like you were absolutely insane. And so it was very challenging. Making the film was next to impossible. In fact, in retrospect, I really have no idea how I was able to do it. But what was fascinating about it that's reflected in the film is that as we were in post-production editing the movie, this whole set of scandals began to break, starting with the Burton Clinic, which is detailed in the movie. And that was one of actually a fistful of different treatments that were all reliving the same story that Hoxsey had been through. And we finished the movie in 1987, and then I distributed it and got it out in the world. But what was fascinating, what became an adventure, was that all these scandals were breaking just at the moment the movie was released. And we were actually part of a much larger movement at that point and kind of flowed into that. Because of the Burton incident, 39 congressmen demanded that their research arm, called the Office of Technology Assessment, do an investigation of alternative cancer therapies, starting with Burton, but then they expanded it. And they hired a historian from the University of Chicago, a very objective historian who had no axe to grind and no ideology, very conventional, in fact. And she was asked to review the history of several treatments, including Hoxsey. And she ended up finding exactly the same data that I did on the Hoxsey herbs, that they were anti-tumor and immune-enhancing herbs. And that was suppressed from the report by the Office of Technology Assessment and blew up into a huge scandal. I actually wrote an investigative piece about that, that along with the movie was named for the Best Censored Stories Journalistic Award for Investigative Journalism. But we were part of this huge wave, and you could just kind of almost feel Hoxsey in the ether out there laughing at this whole thing happening. It was quite extraordinary. But what that led to ultimately through this congressional action was first, the Office of Alternative Medicine, which then morphed into the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine, whose mission is to actually do the research and study alternative therapies, and particularly alternative cancer therapies. So it's a very different world now, 15 years later.
Indeed it is. Kenny, one of the things that fascinated me about the film is that you were able to get cynics and skeptics to actually appear in interviews on the film. How did you get these people to cooperate with you?
With great difficulty. They were extremely suspicious, and ultimately the case that I made that was compelling to them was that if they didn't participate in the film, their voice would not be heard, and if they truly believed that these people were quacks, it was really their duty to inform the public of that. And I am a journalist, and I approached it as objectively as I knew how to do, and I really didn't have an axe to grind. I think the story speaks for itself in terms of what happened, and it's only been validated over the years through many other experiences similar to Hoxsey's. But the film never seeks to prove and could not prove the efficacy of the treatment. What's clear is that it was politically railroaded rather than medically tested, and that actually culminated in 2001, where the National Center for Complementary and Alternative Medicine sent some of their own researchers to the Tijuana clinic, and they reviewed multiple patient case histories and then tracked those patients and looked at all the records very scrupulously, and they found 7 bulletproof cures, unequivocal. One of them being a melanoma, which the average life expectancy would have been about 7 months, and this person had already lived for 7 years and was still alive and had had no treatment besides Hoxi. So this federal agency itself recommended, because of these what they called noteworthy cases of survival, they recommended that the Hoxi treatment indeed should be investigated. 75 years late, but better late than never. So
it's a huge story, Kenny, and you made the movie and it was released. Then what happened?
Well, it was, I thought making the movie was an ordeal, but distributing it certainly rivaled that. And the standard procedure is you go to film festivals and then you hope to get a distributor, and we did that. I had just hooked up at that time with the woman who became my wife and partner, a business partner, Nina Simons, and Nina's an extraordinary communicator and marketer and was very passionate about this project. So we went to all these festivals, and the movie got incredible reviews, actually, almost across the board. The New York Times called it first-rate reportage, and the only ones who didn't like it actually were the Wall Street Journal, which is not surprising. But we got several offers of distribution, but I really wasn't satisfied with them, and I didn't have confidence that the distributors would stay with it, so we ended up doing it ourselves.
You won major awards, didn't you?
We did, yeah. And
tell us about those.
Well, the biggest coup actually was we got it screened theatrically in about a dozen cities in movie theaters, which was very tough to do, and then we sold it to HBO, where it ended up getting the highest viewer response of any documentary they had ever shown.
Now, after the movie, I know that you went on to have a very varied career with many aspects to it. Tell us about that.
Well, I was kind of burned out from making the film and then spending better than a year distributing it, and I just had a hard time facing the idea of starting all over again. But the other thing for me was that I had learned a lot about the environment at that point, and what we knew then and we know now is that 70 to 90% of cancer, for example, is directly caused by environmental and occupational factors. In other words, the environment and our workplace, which is the industrial toxic, metabolism. And so I really felt that I wanted to do something relating to the environment, and I ended up starting a company in 1989 called Seeds of Change, which is sort of a backyard biodiversity seed company in an effort to stem the loss of diversity in our food supply. And about a year after that, I started a nonprofit environmental group called the Bioneers, which is really solution-oriented and deals with things like green medicine and how we can detoxify our industrial metabolism and so forth. And I really wanted to do something that I felt had a very tangible, practical effect. But I never lost my interest in the subject of Hoxi. And in the mid-90s, I decided to go ahead and do a book about it, actually, because film is such a concise medium. There's only so much you can really fit into 83 minutes or whatever. And so I had done huge years worth of research, and it was such a fascinating, compelling story to me still that I went and did this book called When Healing Becomes a Crime. And I was grateful that I did it, among other reasons, because I had interviewed all the principals from that period, including, of course, Mildred Nelson, all of whom ultimately died. Mildred died around 1999, and I was very grateful that she had the manuscript on her bedside, so at least she got to see it before it was all over.
Kenny, you've seen a lot of changes in what we now call complementary and alternative therapies. What are the major changes now compared to when you entered this field in the 80s?
Well, it's a really good question, Larry, and of course you've witnessed it as a physician in the field you work in, particularly around spirituality and prayer and healing and so forth. But one couldn't even really talk about these ideas 20 years ago. I mean, they were so fringe as to be regarded as frivolous and silly. And a lot of what's really happened is that it's been, the change has been driven by the public. It's not the medical profession that has been progressive in this regard. It's been public demand and the demands of the market. Vast numbers of the American public are now using alternative therapies. It's well over 50%, and that's out of pocket. Most of it is not covered by insurance. So that above all is what's moved it forward. And then more and more there is data and there is evidence for all this stuff. And some of the factors that continue to drive alternative medicine forward, of course, are cost factors. It's vastly less expensive than conventional medicine. It's also much safer. I mean, the Hippocratic Oath is to first do no harm, yet conventional medicine is often very, very harmful. You know, witness in the Hoxsey film, surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, very dangerous therapies, all of them. Not that they don't have a place, they do, but you have to ask what is the safest treatment as well. And that's, I think, partly why the public likes alternatives. There's much less danger of catastrophe with these things. And if they don't work, the worst they're going to do is nothing. But I think that, you know, we're really witnessing a public shift, and the medical profession bit by piece is catching up, and then the economics are going to drive a lot of the change, really.
Looking back on the film, Kenny, I was really amazed at the level of vehemence and hatred that the cynics and critics displayed toward Hoxsey. Do you think that there's any level of evidence that he could have marshaled which would have won the day back when he was so controversial?
I don't think that he could have convinced the people who just didn't want to believe in it. And, you know, I thought about this a lot, and I've contemplated this a lot, because it's a very serious thing to suppress a promising treatment for cancer. I mean, who would do that knowingly? That's almost a crime against humanity, in a sense. And on the one hand, you have huge financial forces. We know this. I mean, cancer is huge business, and that was really the beginning of it during Hoxsey. He was born up against the golden age of the doctor and the corporatization of medicine. That's really what he was facing. Cancer treatment today is well over $110 billion a year. It's 10% of the entire healthcare economy. An average patient spends well over $100,000. So this is a high-ticket item. And certainly when there's money at stake, that drives people's thinking without any question, in my opinion. However, what I really learned was there was a whole other dimension to it, which was about belief systems and ideology, or you could almost say theology, because there's no evidence for these beliefs. It's almost religious in a sense, that it's an article of faith. So I actually think that the people who opposed Hoxsey at that level, and you know, just this was contrary to their belief system. It was also contrary to medical education, which is not very different today, although it is changing bit by piece. But you know, when doctors go to school, they simply don't learn about all this. In fact, they learn that this stuff is not to be taken seriously and is dangerous, if anything. So you know, a lot of it does come back to belief systems, and I think that's equally true with the patients. And you know, you work in this field extensively, but the belief that a person has does definitely have an impact on the therapeutic outcome. And it's not always decisive, but if you really do believe something is going to help you, you certainly have a much better chance with it, for the most part.
Kenny, when you took your cameras into the Hoxsey Clinic, does anything stand out for you? Any juicy memory that really remains?
Well, it was a very powerful experience. What happened initially was Catherine Salveson, who co-produced the movie with me, who's a public health nurse, she and I went down to visit the clinic before we started the movie. We wanted to see for ourselves what was really going on. And we spent a long 3 or 4 days there over a Memorial Day weekend. You know, I went down with a considerable amount of skepticism and with some trepidation. You know, the idea of going to a cancer clinic in itself is kind of scary, and one that might be a kind of a quack clinic with bare light bulbs and dirty needles and, you know, all the stereotypes that we all hold. And you walk into this bright, beautiful, sunlit place in Mexico, which always feels very different from being in the United States. It was a very open feeling and a very personable kind of a feeling. And then we followed Mildred around for, you know, about 2 days. And she was an extraordinary woman, kind of a cross between Mother Teresa and Calamity Jane. And then we met one after another of these patients who all had been given up to die. And it had been 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, you know, that they were well, having done nothing but Hoxsey. And, you know, it's like falling through the rabbit hole. You're in this whole other world all of a sudden. And we were completely transformed by that experience. So it was very interesting when we came back with the cameras and brought the crew, all of whom brought the same skepticism and kind of fear, you know, to the situation. And we watched with some amusement as they went through the same kind of a passage that we had been through. And I think the most extraordinary moments were the time that we spent with Mildred in her trailer. She had a lot of Mexican velvet paintings on the wall and, you know, a very simple lifestyle. She was the most extraordinary storyteller I think I've ever met. And she was very slow, and you know, you're from Texas, you know how that kind of thing goes.
Yes, I admired her manner of speaking.
It's kind of like being around the campfire, and she would hold court, and we would have the cameras going and just have our jaw on the floor at these exquisite stories that she would tell. And of course, we were concerned about the editing because you have to shorten it somehow at the end of the day, and she was not a rapid storyteller by any means.
Kenny, I think Mildred Nelson was probably the perfect match for Harry Hoxsey. Both of these characters were larger than life. They had immense charisma, charm, personal magnetism. How important do you think the charismatic aspects were in how the patients did down at the Hoxie Clinic?
I think it's very, very important, actually. And that's a really interesting question because I don't know that it's answerable. Ultimately, that's one of the complexities of studying alternative medicine. You look at the Hoxie program. There's the herbal tonic. There are the external salves. These are obviously very physical medicines. Then you have the diet, which certainly when Hoxie started was a very radical thing. Fishbein himself said, diet has absolutely no influence on health. I mean, so that's what Hoxie was up against. But the diet is, again, a physical thing. But then there was this whole other dimension of hope. And Hoxie was repeatedly this incredibly charismatic figure who was larger than life to people and who truly cared about people. He loved his patients and went way beyond the pale to help them, including putting money out of his own pocket and the whole bit. And Mildred was just an extraordinary healer. She had a very different personality from Hoxie, obviously, and Mildred really was the quintessential nurse, and she just lived for her patients. When we would sit with her in her trailer, the phone would literally ring 24 hours a day, and she refused to have an answering machine. She said, well, if you had cancer, would you want to get an answering machine? I mean, that's dedication. You can't buy something like that. That's a human trait that is very rare today, even in medicine, So yes, I think that their charisma had a great influence on the patients.
Now, people who watch this film are going to want to know the answer to a bottom line question. Does the Hoxie program work? If you had to give a bottom line answer to that, what would it be?
I would give a qualified yes. Hoxie never said that it was a panacea or a cure-all. No one involved with the treatment has ever said that. What's clear to me after many, many years of investigating it and examining all the records and getting third-party medical professionals to kick the tires on all these medical records and the federal government now, but there's no question that a significant proportion of people do get well from using Hoxie. It is not a cure-all. It's not for everybody. There are a lot of factors involved that are very complex, but obviously it's something that does work in a good number of cases, and for that reason alone should be studied at the least. And the larger issue, in a sense, which is very much raised in the film, and certainly from a patient's point of view, is just what you're asking here about. The ultimate test is outcomes here, but there is a civil liberties issue involved. It's really what people say is medical civil rights. It's your body, it's your life or your death. Shouldn't you have the right to choose what therapy you want to do? And really the issue there, I think, is informed consent, that you have a full exposition of the options that are open to you with reliable data if possible, so you know what you're getting into. And then really at the end of the day, it's your choice, And the irony to me, with a lot of the conventional position where they say, no, you can't go this other route, it's dangerous. Conventional medicine generally is much more dangerous than the alternatives. And really, I think, speaking certainly from a personal point of view for myself, I want the right to make my own choice. And I think for cancer patients, that's what I've always found, and I've talked to a lot of folks in this position, and the statistics are interesting. Only 5% of cancer patients completely abandon conventional medicine and do nothing but an alternative. Most patients want the best of all worlds. They want to do a little bit of whatever might help them. And that, to me, is sensible, And then, of course, the other irony of the situation, as you know, is that 85% of conventional medical treatments are unproven. So for all the controversy about Hoxie being unproven, it's never been disproven because they've never tested it. Let's start there. But beyond that, conventional medicine itself is unproven. I mean, most of these things were grandfathered in without clinical trials, which only began in the 1960s, So that's the irony of the situation.
Also, a lot of the skeptics, Kenny, criticize these alternative approaches in this way. They say that they lure people away from conventional medicine. And so they shouldn't be permitted to do that. They should be suppressed. But survey after survey shows that Americans are extremely pragmatic. They do not abandon conventional approaches to the treatment, in the treatment of cancer or heart disease, for example. They do everything that they think is going to work. So they use a composite approach. They do not bail out of conventional medicine in favor of alternatives. And I think that this is a fiction that is very dangerous out there that is used to suppress alternative approaches to the major diseases of our day. And I think you've clarified this for us, and I'm really grateful that this film has helped do that.
Well, and the other extension of that, too, is that, for example, today they did a study a couple years ago at MD Anderson, which, along with Sloan Kettering, is the largest cancer center in the country, 13,000 patients. And what they found was 83% of their patients were using an alternative cancer therapy. And most of that is off the grid. They don't even tell their doctors because they're going to get such heat for it. And that is unfortunate because a physician really ought to know the full picture of what a person is doing. And there might even, in fact, be contraindications that it might be dangerous to use a certain herb if you're using chemotherapy. And these are very real concerns. So I think it's, one of the tragedies of that conventional bias is that it's creating danger and peril for patients in those situations. And the truth is, at the end of the day, medicine is about outcomes. Patients don't care what got them well, they just want to get well. What we really want is reliable information, good research, and the freedom to make our own choice. And, I get a lot of calls even today from cancer patients asking, what shall I do? And, I'm not a doctor or a medical professional. I'm a journalist, basically, and a citizen, I have studied the field a lot, and I know a few things. But what I always recommend to people are two referral services. One is called the Moss Reports, and it's a very rigorous examination of both conventional and alternative treatments that's specific to the type of cancer, the stage of cancer, the person's age, all the different factors that go into it. And then they give you a printout that's customized that shows you all of what is known, and then you can make a much better decision. And then there's another group called Can Help that does a very similar kind of a referral service. Because at the end of the day, people find themselves caught in this situation, and there's the doctor. It's almost, I compare it to terrorism, actually, to medical terrorism, because they say, you have cancer, you have to go in and get this treatment in 24 hours. And you don't even have time to think about where you are in your life, to wonder if you have other choices. Are they telling you accurate information? There's so much misdiagnosis or just forcing people into treatments that may be very impulsive and not really the appropriate thing to do. So for me, I always ask, I tell people, you should, if a doctor says this treatment is going to work, ask for the data and ask for other people that have been helped by it and talk to them, get some more information. Don't just rush into this. You've got more than 24 hours to make a decision.
Also important these days is the role of spirituality in getting well. From your exposure to Hoxsey and the Hoxsey approach, do you think that spirituality played a role in what was going on in the Hoxsey program?
Absolutely, and certainly Bernie Siegel speaks very eloquently to that in the film. But it was interesting because for many years, particularly in the 40s and 50s, some of the largest constituencies who came regularly to Hoxsey were the Mormons and Latter-day Saints, and the Mennonite community was another one. So I always found that, interesting. But certainly, Mildred would never talk about spirituality in those kinds of terms, but she was a deeply spiritual person, in my opinion, and very dedicated to alleviating human suffering and had a much bigger worldview than that this was just a physical disease. You have to look at the whole human being.
Do you have a take-home message you would like those people to get from the film? If you had just one thing that you would want them to deduce from what you've done, what would that be?
Well, I have two things. Okay. One is that we know that there are viable alternative treatments for cancer. I mean, this is just not a question at this point. We just don't know the particulars of that yet. So there's a lot of hope in that. There's much more available to patients than we had been led to believe by conventional medicine. And so I think that's a big positive. The other thing is that medicine is political. And that's really what the movie is about. It's about the politics of medicine. And we all need to become engaged and get involved, wherever that may lead you, because ultimately we do deserve the right to choose, and we should be seeing more and more federal dollars spent on the kind of research that is going to save lives and save a lot of anguish and suffering. So I have to say to people, get involved.
Kenny, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you.